In the name of our loving and liberating God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. Please be seated. The message that I will share with you today is about the challenging peace of Jesus and how, if we open ourselves to follow this path, we can be transformed. Jesus shares some rather tricky and challenging teachings with his disciples in today's text, which comes shortly after the blessings issued in his Sermon on the Mount. When Jesus tells his disciples that he comes not to bring peace, but a sword, and that family members will be set in conflict against each other, they must experience something akin to cognitive dissonance, their hearts sinking, their minds twitching. These strong statements by Jesus seem at first to contradict or at least muddy the waters of his litany of blessings, known as the Beatitudes. Jesus said that blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. So why does Jesus seem to bless the peacemakers in one statement and then deny his own role as a peacemaker in another breath? It reminds me of the statement that I heard ad nauseum from adults in authority during a certain period in my life when I lived in teenage angst. Do as I say, not as I do. I was much more keen on what the adults did rather than what they were telling me to do. But in reality, there's no contradiction between what's stated in the Sermon on the Mount, in the blessings issued, and in what Jesus does in his statement about peace and a sword. This statement brings us a fuller, more nuanced, and realistic picture of the challenging road that we will travel if we follow Jesus on this path to peacemaking. This fuller picture tells us that peace is not a destination or end unto itself, but a state of bearing witness in the world. It is something that we are called to enact as followers of Jesus. This sword that Jesus speaks of has nothing to do with actual weapons. His is a sword that symbolizes the inherent struggle and strife that is present in genuine peacemaking. The sword that Jesus speaks of has to do with recognizing the human dignity of all people and having compassion and respect for every living being. The sword has to do with breaking down the unjust isms that divide and conquer our humanity and our fragile earth. Jesus challenges us to think about and to commit to do this hard work of peacemaking. How do we live out the call to be a people that fully claims the blessings of Jesus and their resulting challenges and see them through to the very end? Blessed are the poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, the peacemakers. How do we follow and do this work through thick and thin as individuals, as a faith community, and as a larger society? I found it helpful to think of the sword not as a metaphor for violence, but rather for a rupture, a breaking down, a departure from the status quo, and an opportunity for something fresh, new, and more peaceful and just to take shape. Jesus was preparing his disciples then, and equips us now to work towards this peace and justice effort. It will cause eruptions, and it will challenge us in ways we can't even imagine. It will stretch our perceived capacities as individuals and shake up all notions of normalcy. Many people and many structures of power will not like this rupture. But present in this struggle, over a span of an uncertain amount of time, lies a path to peace, to the reign of God's love, justice, and inclusion. The first challenge, I believe, happens at the personal level. The challenging peace of Jesus causes us to examine ourselves, our relationships with others, and with the world around us at a deep level. As Jesus says, this very well may result in conflict in some of our most treasured relationships. I faced such a challenge, one of the greatest in my life, over the issue of my interracial, intercultural relationship while in college. My freshman year, I had immediately immersed myself in student activism, and as I was growing into greater consciousness and pride for my own Latino cultural heritage, I quickly joined a Chicano Latino student group known for its militant stances. I had been drawn, though, to participate in the group's educational outreach projects and made weekly presentations to local high school youth of color about college prep requirements in the university system. I loved this outreach, and for a time I felt so aligned and so in community with my fellow Chicano activists. But that soon changed as I began to hear pejorative comments from various group members about interracial relationships, particularly when Latinos dated white people. My heart sank as I heard these comments. I had been with my girlfriend for several years. I had been new to the group, so my relationship had not come up, and it hadn't occurred to me until that moment that it might be seen in a negative light. People were talking in such ways that folks who were in these kinds of relationships were sellouts or traitors to the movement. I grew more uncomfortable as I heard similar comments made over a few months, yet I remained in the group because I genuinely enjoyed the outreach work. Over summer leading into my sophomore year, I developed an identity crisis as my girlfriend transferred into the college. I was in a major emotional and social tailspin. Was I a sellout? I began to question myself and my relationship, struggling with group and personal allegiances. The group pressure was too much for me to bear, and I made the terrible decision of ending my relationship with my girlfriend for fear of judgment from my group. Shortly after making this decision, I felt an incredible sense of remorse. My heart ached. I was angry at the student group and disappointed in my own decision. Most importantly, I realized that I had made the wrong decision. I loved my girlfriend, and I came to know that this love was born out of God's love. I knew that I had to face my fear and go public with my fellow student activists and restore my relationship. This challenged me at every level imaginable. Ultimately, I turned to God for an answer. I prayed, I cried, and I came to see that Jesus was calling me to live into this love and to help break down cultural barriers through my relationship. I began to make sense of my own internalized depression and how it impacted me. And I also began to understand why might my fellow student allies have such a response, their own internalized depression. And yet here was Jesus calling me to deal with the sword and to claim both my cultural identity and my love for someone of another culture as gifts of God. Rebecca is now my beloved wife of nearly 13 years and the mother of our children. This challenging piece of Jesus causes us to find our most truthful place and to speak and to act from it, even when it risks affecting our comfort or sense of security or belonging. In fact, this is probably when we are most needed to speak and to act. We also needn't look very far to find the examples of where this challenge of peacemaking is needed to cause an eruption within the status quo, in the structures of power and domination. We face rising income inequality in our country. Millions of others remain unemployed. We've been hearing of almost weekly occurrences of school shootings and other incidents of gun violence throughout the country. Immigrant communities face over 1,100 deportations daily, while thousands of young children and youth, many of them alone, cross the border to enter into our country, fleeing economic and political violence. The recurring drumbeats of our failed military involvement in Iraq have returned. These are just to name a few. And yet, we can also take heart in the fact that there are examples, past and present, where much needed eruptions have taken place or are taking place. Consider many social movements over the centuries, from the abolition movement to the civil rights movement and other people of color movements for liberation, to the LGBTQ rights movement, we can quickly get a picture of such eruptions. Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat that fateful day so many years ago was an organized eruption, an incredible act of peacemaking and justice-seeking for her community. And it was surely seen as a sword in the side of the entrenched Jim Crow racist establishment. And in response to that eruption, the power structure did respond with many violent swords. In fact, yesterday we recognized the 50th anniversary of the murders of 3 civil rights activists in Mississippi: James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. They were doing voter registration in the state when they were picked up and detained by the police and then handed over to the KKK. But once the peacemaking sword of this movement emerged, it could not be stopped, regardless of these violent acts. As Cesar Chavez has said about the farm workers movement, you cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore. We have seen the future, and the future is ours. And so it is my belief that Jesus comes not to bring peace, but a sword, to further demonstrate that we need a variety of responses to create these pathways to peace with justice, from personal acts of healing and compassion to service and acts of righteous indignation. We see this variety of responses in the parents and families impacted by gun violence in recent years. In the wake of the Sandy Hook massacre, groups like Sandy Hook Promise are pursuing holistic solutions, developing resources for mental health, community well-being, and for gun safety. At critical moments, we also need to insert that metaphorical sword to enter into a situation to cause a rupture. We need prophetic voices and action that help raise our consciousness, tug at our heartstrings, and compel us to act. We need the hurting, courageous, and enraged voice of a Richard Martinez lamenting the loss of his son Chris in the recent Isla Vista shooting, crying for justice that not one more life be taken away. If you have yet to hear his brief statement just hours after the incident, I commend it to you. A brief portion of it is here. Chris died because of craven, irresponsible politicians and the NRA. They talk about gun rights. What about Chris's right to live? Stop this madness. We don't have to live like this. Too many have died. We should say to ourselves, not one more. Theologian Gustavo Gutierrez has stated that the second beatitude, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted," suggests the sorrow over mourning of a catastrophe or oppression. As such, he interprets this to mean that blessed then are those who refuse to resign themselves to injustice and oppression in the world. And blessed are those who have known how to share the sorrow of others to the point of tears. This sorrow and resolve for action that Richard Martinez expresses has now been heard throughout the nation, and it has the potential to propel this issue of peacemaking forward in new and critical ways. This "not one more" phrase has also been used by activists in the anti-deportation movement for several years, and is fitting for much of the peacemaking work that we need to be doing these days. Jesus blessed and stood with those who are suffering on the margins, or seeking to redress the injustices that create suffering to begin with. So today, in the spirit of hope, let us say, not one more death to gun violence, not one more deportation, not one more young person of color incarcerated, not one more woman or child abused or violated, not one more transgender person harmed, not one more child migrant crossing a border alone, not one more, not one more. This is the sword that Jesus speaks of. We can't have a happy-go-lucky peace as much as we might like to. We can't really live into the blessing of God or live into this tradition of Jesus or have the peace that Jesus calls us to without the hard work of challenging ourselves and the systemic injustices in our midst, as well as our own complicity in these systems. We simply cannot. We must engage in consistent acts of love, solidarity, justice, and compassion for all people, and especially, as Matthew reminds us in this gospel, for the least of these. I know you've heard this before many times, but the challenge is for us to do it, to make it happen. So we must all remind ourselves of this commitment that we make and this work that we will do together. And I'm thrilled that we are actively engaging in many of these issues here as a community. And we're not going about it haphazardly or with a knee-jerk response, but we are firmly rooted in our faith and in our convictions as we do this work. Whether it's economic justice or gun violence prevention or environmental restoration and justice, we are becoming equipped in these issues on how to approach them from our faith and how to have the skills to really take tangible action. When we do this, we are engaging in the creative, strategic use of the metaphorical sword in the peacemaking, justice-seeking way of Jesus. Today, we also observe Ask Day, which you'll hear about more in the greetings. It is a national campaign for parents and all who care for children to ask the simple question, is there an unlocked gun in your house? Before sending your child over to play. Given that 1 in 3 American homes with children have a gun in them, many of them which are unlocked or loaded, we can no longer remain silent on this. This issue hits home for me on a deeply personal level as well. When I was 9 years old, I accidentally shot my own cousin, who's a dear brother to me, in the eye with a pellet gun, making him permanently blind in this eye. We were visiting a family friend's house who had a teenage son in the home that was into hunting. We found the gun unlocked with pellets accessible in the teenager's room. We took it outside and began shooting at empty cans. Then the accident happened in a blur. Had it been bullets instead of pellets, my cousin would surely be dead. We can't take these chances with our children. We can't afford not to ask these questions. To have this courage to ask your friends and your family members about unlocked guns in their home is to engage in this real hard work of peacemaking in the way of Jesus. And it is holy, transformative, and life-sustaining work. So as we follow this path to Jesus, to build that beloved community that engages in this transformative peacemaking, we need to begin with ourselves. We need sustenance for the journey. We need to work on our own internal issues so that we can be effective externally. It can be taxing and overwhelming work. So in order to sustain us on that journey, I offer you a few words from Richard Rohr that have helped guide me. If you want others to be more loving, choose to love first. If you want a reconciled outer world, reconcile your own inner world. If you are working for peace out there, create it inside as well. If you are working for justice, treat yourself justly too. If the world seems desperate, let go of your own despair. If your situation feels hopeless, honor the one spot of hope inside of you. If you want to find God, then honor God within you, and you will always see God beyond you. For it is only God in you who knows where and how to look for God. Amen.